Welcome to Humans in AI, where I interview world-class AI leaders and creators to uncover best practices and insights for navigating the world of AI. I'm host Haroon Chaudhry, the human behind Notabot and co-founder of Autoblocks. In this episode, we dive into the topic of open source LLMs and how they can be extremely powerful in advancing the technology. Our guest, Matei Zaharia, co-founder and chief technologist of Databricks, shares his insights on open source LLMs and the importance of making technology available to everyone. He also talks about Databricks' mission to democratize data in AI, their open source LLM Dolly, and how open source standards have played a crucial role in achieving this goal. Join us as we learn from Matei's experience and vision for the future of this technology. Let's dive in. Welcome, Matei.
Thanks so much for having me here, Haroon.
Of course, yeah, my pleasure. So to kick things off, would love to have maybe a quick intro, a little bit of a background on yourself and what you do at Databricks.
Yeah, sure. So I'm the co-founder and the CTO at Databricks. I've worked on a whole bunch of things there. The company's about 10 years old. It started out of my graduate research where we built the Apache Spark computing engine. So that was basically my PhD thesis, the first version of that. And then, I've worked on a whole bunch of other things there, including designing MLflow, the open source MLOps framework, and now some of the large language model stuff we're doing. And I split my time between Databricks and Stanford. So I'm also a professor at Stanford, where I've been doing research actually on language models, efficiency for them, and also tying them to external information sources like search engines for the past, 3 years or so.
Amazing. And I was at Hex previously, and I know I've been following Databricks very closely, and congratulations to you and the team on just the enormous success. I mean, I know a few years ago it was like Snowflake was the behemoth that people thought was going to be really hard to dethrone. And I mean, there came Databricks, enormously successful over the past few years. So let's dive into the large language model. So this is of particular interest of not only Databricks, but plenty of organizations out there. So a few days ago, Databricks had announced the release of Dolly, which is their own LLM. Do you mind giving a quick background on Dolly, just maybe a brief overview of what it is and how it distinguishes itself versus some of the other LLMs that folks may be familiar with?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, listening to this has probably heard about and tried ChatGPT, which came out last November and got a lot of interest because it was this very conversational AI that you could just talk to it as a human. You could ask it questions, you could tell it to do something, and it did that for you. And that's something that just you couldn't do before with language models. They were just for very specific tasks like translation or things like that. So everyone's been very excited about that. And the story that a lot of AI folks had thought about with that is like, hey, to achieve that conversational capability, you first need to get really large scale. You need to train, a model on thousands of GPUs for many months. You need to spend millions of dollars. Maybe you need to do some very complicated sort of tuning of it as well with human feedback to get it to follow instructions. And once you do all that, you get this magical thing that can just interact with people and do tasks with them. So with Dolly, we showed that actually you don't need any of that. You can elicit this kind of conversational behavior in just much smaller, much lower cost open source models. And we used a model that was trained 2 years ago. It's only 6 billion parameters compared to 175 billion in GPT-3, and it's fully open source. So like anyone can take this and get a model with these really nice conversational abilities. We only use 50,000 examples of conversations to train it on, of just instructions, basically, like one question to the model and one answer, which is not that hard to come by. And it costs about $10 of cloud computing, about half an hour of running on a machine now. It's the latest version of our code. So it's really something that anyone can try. The really exciting thing is it means more organizations can try to build these conversational AI capabilities in-house. They don't have to send data to a third-party provider. They can really tune it for their domain. And I think it's really going to open up experimentation and research in this space.
Really interesting. If you were to weigh the sort of pros and cons, where did models that are maybe open source and trained on much less parameters, do they fall short in any particular use cases, or are they maybe less suited for particular use cases? or maybe more suited for particular use cases as well?
Neither the base model we start with nor our data set that we use to teach it to do conversations are really state of the art. And so the model on its own, it's not going to be as good as, say, something like GPT-4. On the other hand, this is just the start. It's showing that it's possible to get this. And actually, people are now training this model with more data, for example, and finding it becomes better, or just training it for a longer time. There are also more folks who have released open source based models that are just trained on more data that you can do the same thing with. So just a qualitative sort of assessment so far that we have is this kind of model with fewer parameters is pretty good at just generating text. You can tell it generate a tweet, generate a press release, generate like a scientific paper abstract. So it's actually quite good at the creative and doing fluid sort of text generation. I would say it's not as good in terms of the amount of knowledge it's memorized. So it knows some facts. You can ask it about like some scientific concepts, famous people, stuff like that, but it won't know sort of the long tail of facts, which kind of makes sense because it doesn't have that many parameters. On the flip side, though, I think for many use cases in companies, which would be like our customers, actually, it's not a bad thing because in a company, you usually have much less data than on the web. You don't need a model that can talk to your customers about nuclear fusion or whatever when they have a support. You don't need it to know the history of like France or something like that in the Middle Ages, but you do want it to know about stuff in your company. So I actually think the problem of creating a good model in an enterprise setting is a bit easier. It's less data, much cleaner data. You don't have like junk that you've got on the internet, in your company, and somewhat more narrow scopes of tasks as well. So we're excited overall, but yeah, it's not going to just magically know like some of the things that the larger models know, at least not in its current form.
That makes a ton of sense. So from what I'm understanding, these smaller models, they're maybe better suited for maybe working within companies for the specific company use cases. And then the large language models, as you described, they may have like the long tail of knowledge that is maybe more useful for more of the general models like the ChatGPTs.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll mention that's happening, it's another reason we're excited about, actually one of the main kind of doing in my research as well, is having a model memorize a bunch of facts is okay, but then you just got this giant model that's like really expensive to run, and it's not up to date with the latest facts. So I think the direction's actually going to be the model calling into a search engine or some other system, to pull in the latest information. Like in a bank, the model could just look at your current bank account balance and tell you, well, this is why your transaction was declined. You didn't do this. So that, and actually you can see it even in OpenAI, although they have these like super impressive demos where just on its own, the model knew a lot of facts. They now added these apps where it talks to Bing and other stuff. So if that's the direction, then I think that's, again, very promising for democratizing this technology because you don't need 100 billion parameters to remember all the knowledge. You just need to connect the model with your own systems that provide information. And by the way, this also might help improve the quality and accuracy of the results, which is sometimes a problem with the giant models.
Got it. And what is your focus over to some of the questions that companies might be having around how to actually use these models? The whole story, as you described, was that a model like ChatGPT is so powerful because of the RLHF, because of the number of parameters of the model. Clearly, Dolly has seen incredible performance despite having nearly the number of parameters and despite the RLHF component. What is the key ingredient, if you had to boil it down to one, that enables a model like Dolly to achieve that level of success? Is it just the quality of the examples, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think so. Our impression is, these models are just trained on text from the web, and so they know about all kinds of different text and different contexts it can appear in. Normally, if you just ask one of these large models to generate text, like for example, if you ask it a question, it might just list more questions because it thinks this is a snippet from a web page that's a giant list of questions. And you can kind of prompt it and stuff and try to nudge it to do certain things, but it's pretty finicky. I think the key ingredient is having enough examples and maybe diverse enough examples of the type of conversation you want it to have with humans. And interestingly, in OpenAI's papers, I think the first paper they did on the human feedback, they said they had about 10,000 conversations with real humans, and then they used GPT-3 itself to generate more conversations and also to learn sort of a scoring function to evaluate them. That's the reinforcement learning. interesting. The data set we used is actually from Stanford. It's based on this idea of like using a model to generate conversations and then train it on that. And it's about 50,000 of those, but actually fewer like true human examples than OpenAI had. And it seems to also get the model into this mode. So I think really all these models they kind of know about this concept of dialogue, but they just don't know that when you're prompting them, you want them to be in that mode. So it's almost like with a bit of training, they just crystallize around this mode. It's very interesting. An example or analogy that our CEO, Ali, has is imagine you found like this parrot in the jungle, right? That's the language model. It's like the stochastic parrot. We found that parrots kind of repeat stuff. That's cool. We found that if you put a parrot in a room and like make it just watch TV for a few years, it can suddenly repeat all kinds of interesting stuff about all kinds of topics. But then later we found that if you just show it like Jeopardy, just like an hour of Jeopardy, suddenly it starts answering questions like fluently. That's kind of what happened here. So it kind of knew this mode, but it wasn't really like nudged into just doing this each time you ask it something. So I think that's what's happening. But we're actually doing a bunch of research, like playing with different parameters of this to figure out what is it about the data set and about the base model that gets it to do this. Is it true for all base models? There are some academic like instruction data sets that don't lead to this behavior. So like what's different in those?
Yeah, love it. And especially the parrot example, I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. Tremendous amount of companies thinking about deploying LLMs, using LLMs to create business value. I think I read a statistic the other day that in Q1 of 2023, there were more mentions of AI during earnings calls than I think the previous high times 2. So double the previous high. And so this is top of mind for a lot of companies out there. What would you say the implications are for companies that have been maybe watching what's happening with the developments that OpenAI has really been sort of trailblazing here? What would you say the implications are for those companies when it comes to deploying LLMs for their own business?
Definitely, a lot of companies are interested in adding conversational features or using LLMs to understand their data. Even before ChatGPT came out, we were seeing close to 1,000 of our customers out of about 5,000 or 6,000 total that were using LLMs in some form. Like we're using BERT or like Roberta or like GPTJ, various open source ones. But it was mostly very specialized tasks like translation. I'm going to release this product and I want instructions in all the languages, or sentiment analysis or stuff like that. I think now a lot of them are seeing that you could have interfaces to humans to help workers like inside your company or to talk to customers. And I think the dilemma a lot of them faced was to get these kind of conversational models, you had to go to a third-party provider. So you have to figure out, can I even send data there? Do I want to strategically? What if this company kind of competes with me? They have terms of service actually that you can't use their API to compete with them. So stuff like that. I think with Dolly, it is encouraging a lot more companies to just experiment with building things in-house and keep that as an option and just move faster. Now, the whole exploration of like LLM and chat capabilities isn't bottlenecked on strategic and sort of legal, like terms of service kind of alignment anymore. You can actually start exploring it and maybe even ship something without incurring those risks. And, we'll see where the market ends up. I'm sure many will want to consume these as a service, but many will also want to customize them and control them and like own the data and the models, maybe like even resell the models that they built on their unique data sets. So we'll see where it ends up.
In terms of use cases, a lot of the use cases that we're seeing nowadays are, like you said, around like the customer service angle. But where do you see the space moving? Do you think LLMs are going to proliferate in terms of their use cases within an organization, or are we going to see LLMs play a bigger role in maybe more reasoning tasks within organizations as well?
Yeah, great question. I think customer service is a very common one. More generally, I would say assisting people with a task is a common one. So for example, internally at Databricks, we've actually prototyped a whole bunch of different things with LLMs that we want to use in our business or put into our product. One very popular thing is, we've got a whole lot of documentation. We've got a knowledge base that's public and like forums and stuff like that with customers. And we would love to, when someone asks a question, either while browsing our docs or when going to our knowledge base, to generate an answer. Or like we found this other post that's sort of similar. So it's sort of surfacing information. Think of it as a little bit like a Stack Overflow or Quora type of system. The other one that you can do now is like you can actually analyze feedback you've gotten from people. How when you call customer support, they often record it, or like there's all this, you can write reviews on a website. You can actually analyze that stuff at scale now for semantic information that would have been hard to pull out otherwise. Like, which products is everyone talking about? Is the sentiment changing? Like, what is the top issue? Can you summarize it? And the other one that we're seeing a lot of is helping people in programming, which we've all seen with GitHub Copilot and with Codex and with Hex, actually, you mentioned, and like many other companies are adding these, even like sort of creative tools like Photoshop and so on. They're adding these kind of things. So basically helping people with other tasks they're doing on a computer.
That makes sense. And for all of those use cases, do you think that a self-hosted model like a Dolly is potentially applicable? Or do you think that maybe there's some use cases that you may want to use a model like a ChatGPT, OpenAI, or something else?
So I do think that small and self-hosted model can do very well, and it may be attractive from a business standpoint because you want to own the data or the model or whatever, and like really kind of own and control the quality. You don't want a third party rolling out an update that like kind of helps most people but hurts your application, and then you're stuck with that. In fact, I think a lot of the models that are used basically on in much faster than ChatGPT are intrinsically small. For example, when you do code completion, there are a whole lot of apps out there that do it. They're super fast compared to ChatGPT or GPT-4. They're quite good. That means that they are smaller and self-hostable. I think something like GPT-4 is really powerful in the same way a search engine is for like very broad knowledge. So definitely for asking stuff about the web and any topic, it's awesome. We'll have to see again whether the right answer is a giant model or a kind of medium-sized model plus ability to search and pull in knowledge from other places. But yeah, people are trying both. So it is a powerful general purpose app, the same way like you just go on Google for some things. That is going to exist, I think, for that case.
Totally. And for folks that may eventually host a model like a Dolly in their organization for particular use cases, what is the process of getting it to work and optimizing it for that particular task? Is it going to work right out of the box, or what does it look like to sort of get that configuration and manage it over time?
To basically rebuild like the Dolly model we did, or like swap in your own data and so on, it's very straightforward. We offered some scripts, and like all the tuning to make it follow instructions is just took about 30 minutes with the 50,000 example data set we have. You can put in bigger ones, but it's 30 minutes on one machine. So it's very inexpensive. Some organizations may want to further fine-tune the base model on data in their domain that isn't just conversation. So that's sort of more standard fine-tuning. I think it's kind of an open question of how much of that you need to do, and we're definitely, trying different versions of that. So that might take longer, more machines, more hours, and then after that you make it follow instructions. And now like it kind of knows your domain and does that. I think it's something you can experiment with quickly. In terms of serving the 6 billion parameter model we have, you can serve it off, a single GPU, or you can pick a machine with a few more of them to get like lower latency, but it's fairly reasonable in terms of serving. You don't need to jump through a lot of hoops to figure out like multi-machine serving and stuff like that. And I think even with a bigger one, like there are some open source 20 billion parameter models, you'll be able to get real-time and sort of low-cost inference on one machine with a bunch of GPUs on it.
Makes sense. You've mentioned experimentation a few times. What does experimentation look like in this context?
So as you develop like whatever application you're doing, you need to be able to evaluate the model, and it's kind of a hard problem to figure out how to best do this. You may want to do human evaluation. Which answer do you prefer? Or like, is this answer correct? If you can do anything automatically, that's really great for speeding up your development cycle. So we do see people doing that, actually calling a language model and asking it like, hey, is this answer, related to this document or like whatever, which surprisingly gives you a decent signal. So you need to set up a framework for like, how am I going to test it for my use case? And then I think you also need to set up easy way, like this is the whole MLOps piece. As I experiment with like different data sets, different tuning parameters, different base models, how do I kind of keep track of everything and compare it and reproduce it?
Very helpful. And last question for you, Matei, it's kind of a double question. One, where does the name Dolly come from? And then secondly, how does this sort of weave into Databricks' overall strategy? And why does it make sense for a Databricks to be open sourcing a model like Dolly?
Yeah, so Dolly comes after the first cloned mammal, which was a sheep called Dolly. And we chose that because we used the data set we used came from this Stanford project called Alpaca, which itself was based on this Facebook model called Llama. That's for research only. That's sort of a small model trained on a lot of data with the latest sort of state-of-the-art architecture. And in Alpaca, they showed that if you give this thing 50,000, instruction examples, it becomes conversational. So we wanted to clone that, but with open components, like with an open source based model. And we thought this name Dolly would be really funny for that. And how it fits into Databricks' overall strategy. So from the beginning, the reason we started the company was to democratize data and AI. Even before LLMs and stuff, we saw a small number of companies getting massive success with large data sets and with machine learning. And we thought, hey, everyone should be able to do this. It shouldn't be concentrated. We shouldn't kill industries because like one of the web giants decided to go in and replace everyone else. And it should be available for scientists, for whatever other, nonprofits, other types of uses as well. So it fits really well into that because it's showing people that you can do this on your own. And open source communities are extremely powerful. Everything in our product is based on open standards. It's easy to move things along and you get a massive boost to your product and customers benefit a lot from that. So we think this type of technology should also be open, and soon there might be open things that jump ahead of the internal models at any of the large players in the same way that it happened, for example, distributed computing software, where eventually it had more libraries, more features that some of the proprietary stacks different people had.
Well, thank you so much for your time. And if somebody wants to follow along with the updates with Dolly and all the other work that Databricks is doing, where's the best place for them to follow along?
Yeah, I think if you follow us on Twitter or the company blog, you'll hear we have a lot more things coming out for LLMs in the next few weeks. So definitely stay tuned.
Very excited. Thank you so much for your time, Matei.
Great. Thanks.